Hello, welcome to your online lecture for the course Anatomy and Physiology. Today we are covering the second part of the central nervous system, and we're going to be focusing on the various parts of the brain. The brain is one of the largest organs in adults, and it weighs about 1.4 kilograms or 3 pounds. And it consists of almost 100 billion neurons, and really just the same amount of neuroglia, which recall are the support cells within the brain. Most of the production of new neurons in the brain is going to occur before birth, so we could say during the prenatal period or during prenatal development, so in utero, and then during the first few months of postnatal life. Malnutrition during the crucial prenatal months of neuron multiplication can result in fewer brain cells. After birth, once the development of new neurons stops, neurons tend to then grow in size. But synapses, where nerves come together with other nerves, are going to be made throughout life, but they're also going to be broken. And that really makes the brain a very dynamic and adaptive structure. There are 6 major divisions of the brain: the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain, which are collectively referred to as the brainstem. We also have the cerebellum, which is the second largest part of the brain, as we'll see shortly. The Diencephalon, which includes some structures such as the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland. And the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain. So let's have a look at that at the image here. We have the cerebrum, the largest part of the brain through here. We have the Diencephalon, taking up this structure here more internally. We have the brainstem, which consists of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, and then the cerebellum, the second largest part of the brain. And so those 6 major divisions then would be the medulla, the pons, the midbrain, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the cerebrum. We spoke about gray and white matter when we talked about the spine during the CNS1 lecture, and the brain's gray and white matter is quite similar, so you'll see a lot of similarities. The gray matter within the brain contains cell bodies, synapses, and neuroglia. The location of it is found within the external cortex of the cerebrum, so around the cerebrum. So all this region here would be the gray matter. And its function, it's also found in the cerebellum. Its function is to integrate and process information before initiating a response. And the response that can be initiated in the brain could be a reflex response, it could be a conscious or subconscious response, for example. The white matter consists mainly of bundles of axons, which we call tracts, that are usually myelinated. And remember, myelin is that covering around a nerve axon that's made out of fat that gives it its white color, and that's one of the differentiating features between white and gray matter in terms of color. And myelin will help with conduction of action potentials so that they're faster. We have ascending and descending tracts. The ascending tracts will conduct impulses upwards, and so they are sensory in function. And the descending tracts will conduct impulses downwards, so they descend, and they are the motor tract. So we have sensory information that travels up to the brain that we get from our environment, and then we send down a motor response so that we have some sort of effect to whatever that sensory input was in our environment. And the location of the white matter is usually inside the brain. So we have more of the cortex being the gray matter around, and then within the white matter. And you can see it in terms of differences in color. You can see the white matter found throughout here versus the gray matter around. And then we already discussed the function is that they are conduction routes. The cerebrum is the largest and the uppermost division of the brain, as we already introduced, and it consists of 2 halves, the right and left cerebral hemispheres that are connected, as we'll see later. And the hemispheres are divided by a longitudinal fissure, and we'll talk about the different fissures and sulci that exist within the brain soon as well. And remember that the tissue that divides them is called the falx cerebri, as we spoke about in CNS1. And each hemisphere is divided into lobes. And we have a total of 5 lobes. We have the frontal lobe, so I'll just label this as being the anterior. So if it's anterior, we know that that would make sense that this is the front or frontal lobe, and posterior. And you can see the brainstem here, as we introduced already. Brainstem would be here, and then spinal cord continues, and then we have the cerebellum. So we have the frontal lobe, we have the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, which would be found, so this is one lobe on one side, you'd have a temporal lobe on the other as well, so 2 temporal lobes, and then the occipital lobe, which is at the back. The cerebral cortex, remember that's that outer surface, and that's going to be made up of 6 layers of gray matter. So even though it's a thin surface, this cerebral cortex, it still is consisted of multiple layers of gray matter. And there's a lot that goes on within the cerebral cortex. You have these millions of axon terminals that are going to synapse with millions of dendrites and cell bodies of other neurons. So a lot of interconnection. And last thing I'd like to point out is that the lobes of the brain correspond with the cranial bones that overlie them. So recall the frontal bone, the parietal bone, the occipital bone, and the temporal bone. Let's look a little bit more at some of the external features of the cerebral cortex, so the outer part of the brain. And what you can see when you look at this image are these convoluted structures here, as well as these grooves in between. And so these are what we call gyri and sulci. The gyri are the convolutions. And some examples include the precentral gyrus, the postcentral gyrus, which is actually labeled here. So it's just behind that central gyrus, postcentral gyrus. We have precentral gyrus. There's a cingulate gyrus, and there's also a hippocampal gyrus. These are some examples of the convolutions that you see within the brain on the external part of the cerebral cortex. We also have sulci and fissures, and really fissures are deeper. And so we can describe them as being the grooves that are seen in between the gyri, or almost indentations. So remember, a fissure is going to be deeper. So we have 2 fissure examples here and 2 sulci examples. The longitudinal fissure is the deepest one. And here's an example here of a fissure. You can see it's much deeper than a sulci. The longitudinal fissure is going to divide the cerebrum into its 2 hemispheres. Remember the left and the right hemisphere. And we introduced that term on a previous slide. The lateral fissure is going to be between the temporal and the parietal lobe. So that would be through here, through the temporal, dividing the temporal and parietal lobe. The central sulcus, which is identified and labeled on this image, is here. And this is the dividing the frontal and the parietal lobes. Actually, you can see the label for lateral fissure as well. And then the parieto-occipital sulcus is going to divide the occipital and parietal lobes, as you can see here. Continuing on with the cerebral cortex, we're now looking at functions. In order for normal movements, so we're talking about normal body movements to occur, we need to have many different parts of our nervous system functioning and working together. 2 structures I'd like to point out on this image here is the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. So post being behind, pre being before the central sulcus. So we could say it's a convolution found just posterior to the central sulcus and a convolution found just anterior to, hence the names pre and post. The first one that we'll talk about is the postcentral gyrus. The postcentral gyrus functions mainly as a general somatic sensory area. So it receives impulses from receptors that have to do with temperature, so hot and cold, as well as touch stimuli. The precentral gyrus acts chiefly as the somatic motor area. So impulses from neurons in this area will descend over motor tracts, and eventually they're going to stimulate somatic effectors, which are our skeletal muscles. And so what you can do here is associate the postcentral gyrus then with sensory, and so we call it the somatic sensory area. So somatic sensory area, highlighted on the image. And the precentral gyrus you should associate with motor control. So we call it the somatic motor area, as listed here on the diagram. The transverse gyrus, this is found within as part of the temporal lobe, and it serves as the primary auditory area. And this has to do with hearing. So you can see the transverse gyrus here in the primary auditory area. We also have the occipital lobe that possesses the primary visual areas. So having to do with vision. Here's our visual cortex. You will also see the term association areas. So we have the auditory association area and the visual association area. And so the association cortex of our brain is the cerebral cortex outside of the primary areas, so the primary auditory area, primary visual cortex. And think of it as more essential for mental functions that are more complex than detecting basic dimensions of sensory stimulation. No part of the brain functions alone, and this is really important to remember that many structures of the central nervous system must function together in order for any one part of the brain to function normally. But there are certain areas of the cerebral cortex, as we've just discussed, that engage in predominantly one particular function. Before we talk about the somatic areas of the cerebral cortex, I wanted to remind you about these structures right here. So remember, going back to this previous slide, that we have the postcentral gyrus involved in sensory, and postcentral gyrus involved in sensory, and then we have the precentral gyrus that's involved in motor, and that's going to be important while we hone into this area on this slide. The body parts that are shown on this image here show which parts of the body are mapped to particular areas of the cerebral cortex, and so the exaggerated parts that you can see in the image, such as with the face, they indicate that more cortical area is devoted to processing information to and from the many receptors and motor units that are part of the face in this example, compared to, let's say, the leg or the arm, for example. The primary somatic motor area, we have the precentral gyrus, as we discussed on the last slide, that controls individual muscles. Now, there are neurons that are found just anterior to the precentral gyrus, so immediately anterior to the precentral gyrus, so right here. And this activates groups of muscles simultaneously for controlled movement. So you can think of it as coordinating groups of muscles so that they can move together and permit controlled movement. And so as you can see, the part written in red here, or indicated by red, is showing you motor control versus the sensory component. So you can see that lots of motor control dedicated to the tongue, for example, and sensory to the mouth. Now we're going to talk about the basal nuclei, the internal capsule, and the corpus striatum of the brain. We're going to start here down at basal nuclei. There are a few islands of gray matter that lie deep within the white matter of each hemisphere of the brain, and collectively these are referred to as the basal nuclei. Sometimes you'll hear them referred to as well as the basal ganglia. The basal nuclei we can see in this image on the screen now, but we'll look at it a bit closer on the next slide. The basal nuclei include various masses of matter, such as the lentiform nucleus, which is comprised of the putamen and the pallidum, the amygdaloid nucleus, as well as the caudate nucleus. There's a structure that's associated with the basal nuclei called the internal capsule. And the internal capsule is a large mass of white matter. Now, the caudate nucleus, the lentiform nucleus, as well as the internal capsule, constitute what's referred to as the corpus striatum. And so you can see them written here as caudate nucleus, internal capsule, and lentiform nucleus. And the term corpus striatum means striped body. So that's the appearance that it takes on. The basal nuclei and its associated structures that we just talked about are thought to play a role in terms of their function in regulating voluntary functions. So for example, all of the muscles that must contract in order to allow you to maintain your posture, in order to allow you to walk, among other things, seems to be initiated or modulated within the basal nuclei of the brain. And so the basal nuclei play quite a few roles in our ability to complete activities, but they're also involved in emotion, and they're thought to play a role in our thinking and our learning. On this slide, we can see the basal nuclei a little bit closer. So we have here the corpus striatum, which is comprised, as we discussed on this slide, of the caudate nucleus, the internal capsule, and the lentiform nucleus. So you can see the caudate nucleus, the internal capsule, and the lentiform nucleus, which we know is comprised of itself of the putamen and the pallidum. Now, beneath the cerebral cortex lies the large interior of the cerebrum, and it's composed mainly of white matter that are made up of tracts. And we think of tracts as being pathways of myelinated fibers. And there are three types of tracts that exist that really make up this internal white matter of the cerebrum. And they are called, the first one is association tracts. And these are the most numerous that are found within the cerebrum of the tracts. And what they do is they extend from one gyrus, so one convolution, to another convolution within the same hemisphere. And so you can see association fibers up here that are running within the same hemisphere of the brain from one gyrus to another. There are also commissural tracts. These extend from one gyrus in one hemisphere to the corresponding gyrus in the other hemisphere. And we can see the commissural fibers here. And so they're going from one hemisphere to the next hemisphere, allowing for communication. And a great example is the corpus callosum, which is the structure that really connects our hemispheres together. We also have projection tracts, and these actually travel from the brain to the spinal cord, but also from the spinal cord to the brain. So they project from one area to another in longer distances, and you can see the projection fibers here. And these are going to be comprised of both sensory and motor tracts connecting the brain to other parts of the nervous system. And the final term to go over is called a connectome, which refers to this entire network of all of these different neural connections that exist within the brain. Now let's talk about the diencephalon. This term means between the brain. And so it's a part of the brain that's located between the cerebrum, which is the bulk of the brain, and the midbrain, which, remember, is the most superior part of the brainstem. And it's found around the third ventricle. Some of the main components of the diencephalon are listed below. So we have the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the optic chiasma, and the pineal gland. But there are other structures that are technically a part of the diencephalon. We'll start with the thalamus. The thalamus, a part of the diencephalon as we just discussed, is a dumbbell-shaped mass of gray matter that's made up of many different nuclei. And so here's the thalamus here. It's hard to visualize its shape in this image. But each lateral mass that makes up the thalamus forms one lateral wall of the third ventricle. And we spoke about the third ventricle in CNS 1. There are a large number of axons that conduct impulses into the thalamus. And so because of that, it's really considered to be this major relay station for sensory impulses that are transmitted to the CNS. So once again, a lot of axons will conduct impulses then from other areas in the body up to the thalamus. And then the thalamus will be able to conduct the impulses from itself to other areas. The thalamus performs the following functions. It's involved in emotions. So it can associate the sensory impulses that are in our environment with feelings of pleasantness or unpleasantness. So what we take in around us, all around us every day, we will interpret as something we like or something we don't. And our thalamus is involved in that. It's also involved in the arousal mechanism, so our alerting mechanism. And it's involved in producing or playing a part in the production of complex reflex movements. Now we'll move on to talking about the hypothalamus. The term hypo refers to below, so it is found beneath the thalamus. So our thalamus is up in this region here. Beneath that, we have the hypothalamus. Now it really forms, the hypothalamus that is, it's made of several structures that contribute to the floor of the third ventricle and really the lower parts of the walls of the third ventricle. The hypothalamus is connected to a structure beneath it, the structure here, called the pituitary gland. And it's connected to the pituitary gland by what's called the infundibulum. And this is really a stalk that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, more specifically to the posterior component of the pituitary gland. And both the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland will be discussed in quite a lot of detail in Anatomy and Physiology 2 during the endocrine system. In terms of overall functions, the hypothalamus is hugely important for survival and enjoyment. It is going to be regulating many of the different functions in our body. It has the ability to link our mind to our body. And it also has a very important role in its function to certain systems in our body. And it very closely links our nervous system to our endocrine system. The endocrine system is a system that involves a variety of different glands and hormones that control many different processes throughout our body. But the nervous system role, this is a really fast-acting role. So think of the nervous system as being fast-acting or immediate, but short-term in terms of its response. Whereas the endocrine system, as you'll learn next term, is a much longer-term response. It's slower. It usually involves hormones traveling through the blood versus a very fast impulse, as our nervous system would allow. And it's our hypothalamus that really coordinates these systems that work so closely together. The hypothalamus, though, really plays a lot of different roles, and it's really important to understand that it's the regulator and the coordinator of autonomic activities. So we're talking about activities that we don't have direct control over ourselves, sort of considered to be involuntary activities. And so it really coordinates our cerebral cortex with some of our autonomic nervous system centers. And I won't read all of these out, but just to point out a few important roles of the hypothalamus, it's important in maintaining water balance based on the hormones that it produces. It produces more than just a few hormones that contribute to the function of other hormones in our body as well. And that will be, again, we'll go into detail in the endocrine system, but it's crucial in arousal. It helps regulate your appetite, and it helps maintain normal body temperature. Sometimes the hypothalamus is considered really the thermostat of our body. The pineal gland. This is a gland that is found just above the midbrain. Remember, the midbrain is the most superior part of our brainstem. And the pineal gland is really involved in our body's biological clock. It's involved in our sleep-wake cycle. And so melatonin, which is the hormone that's produced by the pineal gland, is going to change in terms of its concentration within our body depending on the time of day. And so if you're looking at this graph on the right, you can see that into the evening, once it starts getting dark outside, our levels of melatonin will start to increase. And you can see that they will peak in around the middle of the night, closer to not quite when the sun would come up, and then they start to drop down. And so it's melatonin that actually helps us sleep. It's that natural hormone that we produce that helps us sleep. And it is influenced by the sun and the moon, so the changing light levels. And so when people have jobs where they're working throughout the evening during shift work, and then they have to try to sleep during the day, it can be very difficult for their body to go through these normal sleep-wake cycle patterns because we don't have the same influence that the sun and moon would have if we were on a regular schedule. So regulating what's called our circadian or our daily biological clock. We're going to go into a little bit more detail now about the brainstem. The brainstem has three main divisions, which we've already discussed, or at least introduced, which is starting from the most inferior, and we'll label it in a moment, but we have the medulla oblongata, then moving up we have the pons, and then we have the midbrain. And the brainstem, there are 12 main cranial nerves that exist. And so these are different than our spinal nerves. But 10 of these 12 cranial nerves actually originate from the brainstem. In terms of overall structure and function, just like the spinal cord, the brainstem has sensory, motor, as well as reflex functions. It also consists of white matter in the form of projection tracts, and it consists of what's called a reticular formation. A reticular formation is this diffuse network of nerve pathways that are found in the brainstem that connect the spinal cord, the cerebrum, and the cerebellum. And it mediates overall our level of consciousness. But it's this network of primarily gray, but also white matter. Okay, first up we have the medulla oblongata. And that is the first structure that you can see here as one. And so as the spinal cord moves upwards, then the first part of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata. So it's considered the lowest part of the brainstem attached to the spinal cord. And it's found just above the foramen magnum. And remember, that's that large opening in the skull. And that's, as soon as you enter the skull, you'll be at the level of the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata contains what are called pyramids. And the pyramids as part of the medulla oblongata are these two bulges of white matter that are found on the ventral or the front surface of this part of the brainstem. And these pyramids are formed by these fibers that are referred to as pyramidal tracts. In addition, there are these, what's called the reticular formation that consists of clusters of neuron cell bodies. And some of these nuclei that are found here are actually oftentimes referred to as or called the control centers or part of autonomic reflexes. So they might be called the cardiac control center, or they might be called the respiratory control center, for example. They're involved in certain actions such as vomiting, coughing, sneezing, hiccuping, things that we don't necessarily have control over. Although there are more structures involved than what we're going to discuss when it comes to the midbrain, there are two important midbrain structures that are called the red nucleus and the substantia nigra. Okay, red nucleus and substantia nigra. And these consist of these clusters of cell bodies of neurons that are involved in muscular control. In terms of overall function of the midbrain, there's also some cranial nerve reflexes, just like the other components of the brainstem as we discussed. It's involved in communication between the midbrain and the cerebrum. So sometimes the midbrain is referred to as the midsection of the brain, so communication between that and the cerebrum. And then there is some function in auditory and visual centers as well. The brainstem also has tracts passing through it, just like the brain does, just like the spinal cord does. And the tracts can run either from the spine through the brainstem and up to the brain, or from the brain down through the brainstem and into the spinal cord. So they pass through the brainstem. And so some examples here, the spino-reticular, so from the spine to the brain, spinothalamic, so from the spine to the brain or the spine to the thalamus. Cortical spinal refers to from the cortical regions of the brain to the spine. And then here we have again reticulospinal, so it's really the opposite here of spinal reticulo in terms of the direction that the tracts run, and then the nerve impulses through them. This is an image for you to practice your labeling of the brainstem. The cerebellum means little brain, and it's found just below the posterior portion of the cerebrum, as you can see in this image here. There's a transverse fissure that divides or separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum. And the term that we discussed in CNS 1 was the tentorium cerebelli. If you recall as well, there is also a substance or material that separates the two lobes of the cerebellum, and that's called the falx cerebelli. Now, even though the cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain, so after the cerebrum, it contains more neurons than all other parts of the brain, or parts of the nervous system, I should say, combined. And it's said to have really a lot of computing power compared to the other parts of the brain. So much more neuron present. The cerebellum contains both sulci as well as gyri, just like when we spoke about the brain. But the gyri in particular are a lot more slender, they're a lot less prominent. And the parallel running gyri are collectively referred to as folia. And then the final point to make is that we already know there are two cerebellar hemispheres, and the structure in between is called the vermis. So you can see here the right hemisphere of the cerebellum and the left hemisphere, and then the third component that's in the center here is called the vermis. Now some more detail on the structure of the cerebellum, and just make sure you don't mix up cerebellum with cerebrum. It's a common mistake. The outer part of the cerebellum is called the cortex, or the cerebellar cortex, and it's made up of gray matter. So very similar features then to the cerebral cortex as we talked about in the beginning. So we have the presence of cell bodies, the presence of synapses, and neuroglia, those supporting cells. White matter predominates the inside of the cerebellum, and so it takes on this name called arbor vitae. And this means tree of life. And so it gets its name because it looks kind of similar to the branches of a tree, but some would describe it as looking like the veins of a leaf, which you can probably visualize looking at the cerebellum here. The internal white matter of the cerebellum is composed of some shorter and some longer tracts. The shorter tracts conduct impulses from neuron cell bodies that are located in the cerebellar cortex to the neurons that are located more in the interior of the cerebellum. So within the cerebellum, these tracts travel. But the longer tracts, they conduct impulses then to and from the cerebellum. They're longer, so they're capable of doing that. And fibers of the longer tracts are going to enter or leave the cerebellum by way of its three pairs of peduncles. And the peduncles are shown below, so we'll go over those next. But each peduncle, we can say, really allows for the passage of a different long tract. We have listed here the inferior, middle, and superior cerebellar peduncles. The inferior cerebellar peduncle is composed chiefly of tracts that go into the cerebellum from the medulla and from the spinal cord. Notably, the spinocerebellar, the vestibulocerebellar, and the reticulocerebellar tracts. The middle cerebral peduncle, this is composed almost entirely of tracts into the cerebellum from the pons. So we have here the pontocerebellar tract. So remember that when we talk about these tracts, whatever the first part of the word is where it originates, and the second part is where it ends, so where it's traveling to. So in this case, from the spine to the cerebellum. And then finally, the superior cerebellar tracts, or peduncles, are composed chiefly of tracts from the dentate nuclei, which we'll talk about next, through the red nucleus of the midbrain, and then up to the thalamus. The dentate nucleus is an important pair of cerebellar nuclei, and there's one in each hemisphere of the cerebellum. And there are tracts that are present that connect these nuclei with the thalamus and with the motor areas of the cerebral cortex. So by means of these tracts, cerebellar impulses can influence the motor cortex of the cerebrum. Okay, now let's finish up with functions of the cerebellum. Achievement of coordinated movements results in combined efforts from both the cerebrum as well as the cerebellum. And so impulses from the cerebrum, they may be what triggers the actual action to occur. But the impulses from the cerebellum are really involved in planning and coordinating the contractions and the relaxations of the various muscles once movement has begun. So it plays a very important role. So such things as you can see here as coordinating the activities of muscles. We have the maintenance of balance. The cerebellum plays a big role there. Control of posture, making movements more efficient and more coordinated. The cerebrum and the cerebellum then work closely together. The term consciousness, which you've heard of, I'm sure, before, may be defined as a state of awareness of oneself, one's environment, and other humans. But not that much is actually known about the neural mechanisms that contribute to, or I should say, produce consciousness. Now, what is known, what we do know, is that our consciousness depends on the excitation of cortical neurons by impulses that are conducted to them from a network of neurons called the reticular activating system. There we go. Now, without continual excitation of cortical neurons by the reticular activating system's impulses, a person would be unconscious and could not be aroused. Okay, so once again, we need continual excitation of cortical neurons by the reticular activating system in order for a person to be conscious and aware. There are drugs that exist that can depress the reticular activating system and thereby decreasing alertness and inducing sleep. But there are also drugs that exist that can stimulate the reticular activating system, creating an accentuated effect beyond that of what is considered to be normal. So our arousal system involved then in maintaining consciousness. Now on to language. Language functions consist of a person's ability to speak and write words, as well as their ability to understand spoken and written words. Speech centers are located in 3 lobes of the cerebrum: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, and our temporal lobes. The language centers of the brain are located in the left cerebral hemisphere in the majority of the population. So we have 90% here in the left. And then in the right hemisphere for the remainder of the population. And if there's a lesion in these areas that give rise to language deficits, depending on exactly where the lesion is, will determine what particular component of language is affected. So does it have to do with ability to speak or to write, the ability to understand, or to actually understand words that are spoken or those that are written? All depending on location of injury or lesion. Now on to emotions. The subjective experience of emotions and the objective expression of emotions involves functioning of the limbic system that's found within our cerebrum. The image that you can see on the top right here shows you the medial surface of the cerebrum, and this is where most of the structures lie that are part of the limbic system, which includes the cingulate gyrus as well as the hippocampus. These structures have primary connections with various other parts of the brain, in particular the thalamus, the fornix, the septal nuclei, the amygdaloid nucleus, and the hypothalamus, all playing a role in our ability to subjectively experience emotion and then objectively express it. And on our final slide, we'll discuss memory. Memory is considered to be a major mental activity. Our cerebral cortex is capable of storing and retrieving both short and long-term memories. Short-term memories involve the storage of info over really just a few seconds or maybe a few minutes, but our short-term memory can be consolidated by the brain and then stored as long-term memories. And these long-term memories could be retrieved possibly days or even months or years later. Short and long-term memories are functions of many different parts of the cerebral cortex, but in particular, the temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes have areas that are responsible for short and long-term memory. There is also a connection between emotion and memory, and our limbic system also plays a key role in memory. And it's thought that the reason that we can store long-term memory is because of the existence of these structural changes in the neural pathways of our cerebral cortex. Okay, that's the end of today's lecture. Thank you for listening.